Giri. It's a great pleasure, and I wish I could be physically with you, and someday, who knows, I'll be able to do so. The topic that you have proposed me to deal with today is very dear to me, but I have to tell you up front that I've learned a lot from you. I have to say that, and Ananta, who knows my work for some time, I have been writing since 20 years' time, I would say, on the epistemologies of the South, by which I mean knowledges born in struggle by the people that have suffered most from the modern domination, Western-centric domination, which has three main heads or pillars: capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. In fact, it's not just capitalism. I don't think that capitalism can exist without colonialism, and neither of them without patriarchy. We can explain and can discuss that later on. And what I saw when the pandemic came, I saw that the world would be different from then on. I think the 21st century was beginning with the pandemic. Why did I see that? Well, just look back in history, and we see that all the major pandemics in the past, they led to very, very drastic transformations. In the 14th century, in the 19th century, for instance, they were very clearly. And then the Spanish influenza at the beginning of the 20th century. And I said that it would be changing because the roots of this coronavirus pandemic were in the model of development that we have in our world today. I think that the pandemic shows, I'm even mentioned in the book, that probably the virus, I would consider the virus not as an enemy, but as a pedagogue, someone trying to tell us something. And what the virus was telling us was that we cannot go on with the same models of development that we have today forever, because the planet will get exhausted, basically. We have a very, very serious ecological crisis, for which, in fact, the rich countries of the North are most responsible. If you look at the historical accumulation of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, the rich countries account for more than 70% of the emissions. And this crisis is destabilizing the habitats of the wild animals everywhere. And among these wild animals, there are lots of viruses that circulate. But when they circulate among animals, there is no problem. The problem is when they contaminate humans. And we are not really prepared for that. We are not immune. And therefore, we have the pandemic. Well, the pandemic was its name says it all. It's pandemic. All of us are involved. So I thought that the pandemic would be a major lesson for our divided world. That we would see from now on that we were together in the same planet, and therefore subject to the same risks, some more, some less, but that we should find the common solutions. And therefore the pandemic would tell us about what kind of society we are going to have in the near future. And I predicted that there were three scenarios, three possible scenarios for this. One scenario was the scenario that, the pandemic, we have vaccines, and therefore the pandemic will be go away. Nothing changes. We don't have to change anything in our models of development. Probably we have to strengthen our health systems, but that's all. The second scenario is the scenario that, in fact, the pandemic is something new by its vastness, and that we should do something. And something could probably mean that the state would be intervening more in either in the economy, in society, and in the health systems, because as you know, in many countries, wherever there are health systems, they are becoming privatized whenever they were public. Many countries don't have a public system. Others used to have a public system and is being privatized. So health ceases to be a public good to be another business. And I thought that with the pandemic, the second scenario would take us to the idea that health is a public good, and that involves a massive investment in the qualities of our cities, in the qualities of our health, collective health, not individual health, but collective health, the health of our settings in which we live, in order to be preventive. And the third scenario would be the scenario that this pandemic was the great opportunity for us to make a leap forward and start changing our civilization, the Western-centric civilization, as a dominant civilization. Because we know, and you know very well in India, that there are diverse civilizations. There have always been different civilizations in the world. But since the 15th century, the Western-centric civilization claims a kind of superiority over all the others. And my idea is that this superiority is coming to an end. And the pandemic was showing us that the end has arrived. And from then on, we should be trying an alternative. We should be trying what I call a paradigmatic transition. We don't move from one civilization to another from one day to the next. We move slowly, by small steps, by partial measures, but steadily, consistently, towards something new and different and better for the people. Well, these were the three scenarios in 2020. I also predicted that any scenario would transform the relationships between the global north and the global south. By the global north, I mean the developed countries of the Atlantic, the United States, Canada, and Europe, and also in the geographical south, Australia, and New Zealand. This global north, in fact, has maintained a kind of an economic, political, geopolitical superiority over the other regions of the world that we now call the global south. Previously, we have called them third world, we have called them less developed countries, developing countries, emergent countries, non-aligned countries, different names, peripheral countries. And in a sense, this hierarchy, north-south, should be shaken up after the pandemic. And we should see major changes. Well, what do you see today, almost 3 years after the beginning of the pandemic? I think that the scenario that prevails is the first scenario. In fact, the scenario that nothing happens is a kind of a negationism type of scenario that we saw, in fact, in many countries in the beginning, immediately, like in India, for instance, also. In England, Boris Johnson saying there is nothing. Donald Trump in the United States, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. This is not serious. This go away and nothing happens. And we are not going to change anything. Well, in fact, it happened a lot. Millions of people have died. And in those countries that were more negationists of the seriousness of the pandemic, that's where the mortality rates were highest. I demonstrate in the book that the mortality rates were much higher. So I saw that the pandemic was a cruel portrait or photo of our world today. And would show the hypocrisy, particularly if the first scenario would prevail. What would be the hypocrisy? First of all, the idea that we live in a global world, that we are more and more interdependent, that we share the same planet, all the ideas of liberalization of the markets, of comparative advantages, which is neoliberalism, today as a dominant version of capitalism. But I saw that with the pandemic, that would reveal the hypocrisy of this policy. In what consists the hypocrisy? Is that when the pandemic broke out, immediately the global north started to be nationalist. And the major demonstration of that was vaccine nationalism. The idea that the big pharma, the companies that controlled vaccine productions and the active principles, were not prepared to relinquish the patent rights over their principles, active, and do not allow other countries to produce at a very low cost effective vaccines for everyone. And these capacities to produce very cheap vaccines, very efficient vaccines, were present in countries like India, like South Africa, like Uganda, like Indonesia, like in Thailand, like in Brazil, all of these countries were prepared to produce massive vaccines, but they couldn't. So while the global north was over-vaccinated, 4 or 5 doses of the vaccine, in Africa, most people had just 1 doses or 2 doses at the most. And some had none, just to speak of Africa. And within the countries, there was these very wide disparities. So I saw that this would hurt the global south quite deeply, because it was a sanitary emergency. And the global south would get offended by the hypocrisy of the vaccine nationalism. And in fact, in that respect, I was right. When you look at the relationships between today going on between the global north and the global south, we can see that the global south do not trust the north, never trust the north very much, but now does not trust at all the words that come from the global north. And as you know, the hegemon in the global north is the United States, and Europe now is a vassal type of continent, totally dependent on the United States. So I think that this is contributing to a major disturbance and concern in the international relations at this point. So I think that this is one of the consequences of the pandemic, which is a lasting consequence. The second one is written down at the end of the book. It is, in fact, a paper written by the IMF, by some researchers at the IMF, in which they say that after any major pandemic, if nothing is done or said in terms of reforms, there will be major social unrest, protests, and that, according to the logic of the IMF, cannot be solved with better investment in social policies. That's what it should be, but more repressive states. So the idea is that the states will be becoming more repressive. Well, if you look at what is going on now in France, for instance, but in many other countries, in Europe, in Africa, in Latin America, in the United States, you can see that they were right. If there are no social measures or social policies to try to compensate for the loss of the quality of life of people during the pandemic, we are going to have social protests. In fact, we had in India a very good example of this social process, but it was not related, well, it was related to the pandemic, but was using the pandemic to promote the infamous farm laws, as you remember, those famous farm laws that brought the Indian peasants to occupy New Delhi for such a long time, and eventually they succeeded. But I think they were the only ones that succeeded. In most countries, in fact, social protests did not succeed. So I think that the pandemic, because of the first scenario is prevailing, is creating all these tensions, but is creating tensions that are also connected with it, even though the press never mentions that. And another fact that came right after the pandemic is the war in Ukraine. the war in Ukraine is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. Of course, the invasion of Russia in Ukraine was illegal from an international law point of view. No question about that. But who provoked that war? Who really provoked it for a long time, disregarding the existential threats that were being mentioned by Russia in light of the continuing expansion of NATO around the borders of Russia. Well, it was Russia that did this, and the United States disregarded completely the security concerns of Russia. And for that reason, the invasion was illegal, but was also illegal the provocation for this war. But more illegal now and dangerous is the continuation of this war, a war that can become a nuclear war from one day to the next. So the world is going through a period of a kind of contradiction, of levels of contradiction, that turns it into a very unstable situation. And therefore, there are two questions that we can raise. The first is, why the second or the third scenario were not adopted? Well, the second was not adopted because that would be a major change in the current economic domination of the world economic system, neoliberal system. Neoliberal system aims at commodify life everywhere in all its aspects, and therefore any crisis is another opportunity for business. And therefore, one would not expect from neoliberalism any solution to solve this crisis. But we could expect it from the state. After all, when the crisis came, when the pandemic came, people did not resort to the markets. They resort to the state for protection. And the state was not there in most countries to protect them. So the people have been told that the markets solve all the problems of our life, but an emergency comes and the people do not resort to markets. Markets disappear, as a matter of fact. Private hospitals in Europe refuse to accept COVID patients. They didn't want COVID in the hospitals, in the private hospitals. So the state was not there because the state has been defunded, and today is also a neoliberal state in many countries. And therefore, for these reasons, the second scenario was not adopted. What about the third? The idea of a civilizatory or civilizational type of transition. Well, that will depend on social struggles, on people, on education, on massive type of protests, on a new pedagogy about the sense of life, our place, the human place in the total life of the humanity, of the planet. As you know, human life is 0.01% of the total life of the planet. 0.01% of the total life of the planet. It's a minute portion of the total life of the planet. And yet, human life does everything to destroy the planet. And the planet is responding. And the recurrence of the virus is the response of the planet. The planet can survive, of course, without human beings. There will be other beings in the planet after us. And this is something that politicians, intellectuals, do not want to face. And there is no movement in Europe or elsewhere in which this type of transition is made visible. What do we have? What do we have as thousands, millions of initiatives around the world, people in communities. I saw them during the pandemic creating innovative solutions to protect themselves. For instance, the indigenous peoples in Latin America, because the state had abandoned them, they resorted to the traditional medicine, their ancestral medicine, because the ancestral medicine doesn't have vaccines, but has lots of products that increase the immunity of the body. And they protect themselves, as they have protect themselves from the invaders, the colonizers. When the colonizers brought the smallpox to Latin America, to the Americas, millions died, as you know, because they were not protected. So they have learned an historical lesson, and many of them have protected themselves by their own means, because the state was not there. In the slums of Brazil, I witnessed lots of initiatives, local initiatives of people trying to protect the life of the community. For instance, against the fake news that were coming from the state. The state was telling them that the virus is nothing. You don't have to use any protection. You don't have to do this or that. The virus, it's an invention. The virus is an invention. And people were dying. So they would resort to their own systems of protection inside the favelas, the slums. Favelas is the name they have in Brazil. So one of the cases became very famous because they managed to create a parallel system of health protection during the pandemic that saved thousands of lives without the help of the state. We saw the asymmetries in the world. And one of the major asymmetries that I noticed is that the globalization that we have been so much talked about, and very little about inequality, the virus would strengthen, aggravate the inequalities of the world. So I have an whole chapter dedicated to what I call the abyssal line. What is the abyssal line? It's a key concept in my epistemology of the South, which aims at saying a very simple idea, is that in our capitalist, colonialist, and patriarchal societies, there are humans and subhumans. Humanity does not exist as a reality. Humanity is a project, because this system does not allow us to treat everyone as a full human beings. There are full human beings and are subhuman beings. And you can see an abyssal line separating them. When you look at the mortality rates, you can see that black people in the United States died much more than white people, for instance. You can see that poor people, that people that were discriminated for sexual relations or others, were much more dying from the pandemic than all the others. That is to say, the abyssal line, in a sense, was being reproduced. Because, in fact, humanity is not for all. I give you an example of last month. You saw, or probably, I don't know if it came out in the news in India, that a boat that was carrying immigrants into Europe, immigrants coming from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Syria, etc., Afghanistan, and so on, had a problem at sea and, in fact, went down. 700 people were drowned there in that disaster, the shipwreck of this boat. 700 people. Was there any major crisis in Europe when that happened? People didn't talk about that much. And it was at the doors of Europe that happened. But in the meantime, we had a submarine with 5 super rich people that were trying to investigate or know for tourism about the Titanic. And all of a sudden, these 5 people got caught in deep sea. It could not be rescued. And all of a sudden, there was a major crisis in the world, all the news talking about this submarine. But there was no conversation, no talk about the 700 people that had died in the Mediterranean. Why? Because they are subhumans. They're not humans. And this abyssal line became very cruel in many ways during the pandemic. For instance, in prisons became an abyssal line because, in fact, there were no conditions to protect life there, and the mortality rates there are much higher than the rest of the population. Another case that I analyzed were the elderly people. We found asylums or residences for elderly people here in Europe, in which in one day, 800 elderly people were found dead. 800 people were found dead because no one took care of them. The pandemic came, they were in the residence, nobody bothered to enter or to do something, and they just died. Because elderly people were not worth the resources, because they were elderly, of the resources needed to save lives during the pandemic. That was a tragedy for the Italian doctors when they didn't have enough instruments or enough oxygen. And they would withdraw the oxygen from the elderly people to give it to the young people. That is to say, deciding life and death. So all this have led me to come to the idea that only the third scenario could have saved us or can save us in the future from the new pandemics that are coming. Because I'm sure that we are entering a period of what I call recurrent pandemics. The pandemic one pandemic goes, another one will come. It goes through different phases, of course, chronic phases, acute phases, but we are not going to get rid of the pandemics for a long time. And therefore, we are entering in a period in which we have to take seriously the question of what kind of civilization this is. And here are the questions that I'm raising now in the work I've been doing most recently. First, if you look at the civilization, Western civilization, from the 16th century up until now as the dominant civilization, and that in a sense it considered all the others as forms of barbarism in one way or the other, like the natives of the Americas were barbarians, like the Africans were barbarians. Sometimes I think that probably this civilization, seen from the south, could be reconceptualized as a form of barbarism. And we see the barbarism in 5 or 6 events that are quite clearly signs of barbarism coming from the global north. The first one, I already mentioned it, is the ecological crisis. How come that the civilization does nothing on the verge of extinction, and the people that are in charge of the climate change institutions of the United Nations, as you know, are people from the fossil industries, from the oil industries. The representatives of the UN, the people that are working during the COP meetings, they are people from these industries. So can we solve a problem when the people that are trying to solve it are the problem? We cannot. So this is a kind of disguised barbarism, I would say. The second one is the threat of nuclear war. This is another barbarian type of event that can come in the global north, and probably all the rest of the world is going to suffer from it. The United States is considering to throw cluster bombs, as they did in Afghanistan, actually, in Ukraine against Russia targets. Well, cluster bombs is just the step before tactic nuclear weapons. And from the tactic nuclear weapons, we can go to the strategic nuclear weapon. What is this? Are we going to destroy the human speech in the name of peace, in the name of winning a war? This is barbarism, in my view. It's nothing else. The third signal of a kind of a barbarism that is imploding civilization from inside is the rise, the global rise of the extreme right. We can see it everywhere. Of course, we can see it in India, but you can see it in Portugal. You can see it in Italy. They are in the government already in Italy. They probably will be in government next week in Spain. They are in the government in Sweden. They were in government with Trump. They were in government with Bolsonaro in Brazil. The hatred, the polarization, the inquisitorial type of logic of destruction of the other, be it by religious or by other reasons, is telling me that the extreme right is really the destruction of whatever still democratic existed in our societies, wherever democracy is. And then we have this hypocrisy of the United States saying that the big conflict in the world is between democracy and autocracies, meaning United States is a democracy and China is an autocracy. But what we see in the United States is the rise of the extreme right everywhere. They are killing each other all the time, in schools, in supermarkets. They don't believe in many of the scientific ideas that we do believe. I lived in the United States for 35 years, during the fall term, teaching at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And I could see the decline of democracy, the hollowing out of democracy inside of the United States. Money, in fact, is what runs the United States democracy today. So all this tells me that we need a civilizatory type of transformation. And in 2 minutes, I tell you the 3 points of these catchwords. They are catchwords, in fact, for a civilizational transition, for which, in fact, I have to say, I've learned a lot from India, from China, from indigenous peoples for a long time. It does not come from now. I was a student of Rabindranath Tagore and of Gandhi when I was 29 or 30, and I was reading the Upanishads and the Vedic scriptures. So it's not from here, from now. It's from a long time. The 3 key ideas are the following. First, nature does not belong to us. We belong to nature. That is to say, nature is our mother, is our center of our life. We cannot destroy life precisely because our mother is nature. Second, we have to control time. Our civilization, now the Western civilization, does not have time. No one in the West has time. We have lack of time. We manage lack of time. We lost sovereignty, time sovereignty. And the third and finally, we need as much demodiversity as we need biodiversity. There are many different ways of democracy, not just one liberal representative democracy. There are many, many different ways. I call this demodiversity. And without demodiversity, we'll have only wars. So my plea for you and for the time that you have for the conversation is that we should focus on this third scenario and see what possibilities there are in your continent, here and there, to struggle for it. Thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. It was really a very enriching session. And the way you articulate the whole idea of democracy and the quest for civilization towards making democratic central towards equality, fraternity, and justice is really remarkable. And it was very well articulated, the idea of the pandemic in your lecture. While listening your lecture, I was recalling a quote of Frederick Engels, who says, nature is the mother and labor is the father of invention. And with the advent of capitalism, we can see there is a dichotomy between development and democracy. There is a dichotomy between nature and development. And this is a kind of civilizational challenge for all of us to understand the essence of nature, which is very difficult. And that the experience that we have with the advent of uh, um, a pandemic is something which invokes that the essence of nature is the ultimate thing that human can think. So thank you so much for giving a kind of very deep presentation with deep analysis. Now I request respected participant to have a question answer session. So I request Professor Gyan Gului to initiate the discussion.
Yes. Thank you very much. I do not know whether am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Hello? Yeah, thank you very much. It was really impressive, brilliant. First of all, I would like to greet Coimbra, which I visited some times ago for a congress on human sciences, and which is, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful cities I ever seen. So thank you very much. There are really very many points on which to reflect. As regards the crisis which we have now with and due to the war between, perhaps we should say Russia and NATO, and not so much Russia and Ukraine, because I am afraid that the true war, the authentic war, is Russia against the NATO. And this, of course, is very dangerous because we cannot say when it is going to stop and whether it is going to stop. But anyway, I have the impression that this war has not broken out 1 year ago in February, or also some years ago when the first crisis in Donbass exploded, that is 2014. But I have the impression that this war is a persecution of the Cold War. That is, it is a persecution. It is something which broke out when the Soviet Union collapsed. There was Russia. And I am afraid that there was the intent of, I think, the British Foreign Affairs and of the US foreign politics to bring about the old plan of the British Secret Service and of the US counselor for security advisor Brzezinski, who had the project of cutting Russia in 3 parts, that is. And I think that 1991, when the crisis in Yugoslavia, which does not exist now any longer, exploded, the true objective was the destabilization of Russia. That is, through the destruction of Yugoslavia and then through the bombing of Belgrade, 1999, Belgrade was a substitution for Moscow, and the true intent was to let implode Russia from the internal part. I am afraid of this, and I'm afraid that this, which now has exploded more or less 1.5 years ago, is something which was causes we have to find 1991, 1992. And therefore, this is the more dangerous and also the more fearful, I am afraid. I personally do not see any solution, except for the formation of an alternative to the Western devices, dollar, and to the Western values, civilization, through the BRICS, for instance. It is if there is an expansion of the BRICS and of the countries which are adhering to BRICS, perhaps this could bring the Western civilization to reason and to think that there is not only the Western civilization, that is to think that Western civilization is one of the components of the world and not the component of the world, and not the most important component of the world who must lead, who has the destiny to lead all over the world and all over the countries, to dictate the politics of UN and so on and so forth, and all the organization. This is my impression. That is, either we have a strong opposition through the BRICS, or there will be always problem. This war in Ukraine is in my opinion, a war in order to enforce and to strengthen and to confirm the dominance of the dollar, and of all which with its dollar, neoliberalism, and so on and so forth. As regards Europe, I would say I am rather pessimistic, because I am seeing that Europe, that is the Western Europe, is making all what the United States and Great Britain says, and there is no step aside from this line of politics. That's it. We are doing all what they want to. I do not know what it will be in the future, but I am rather pessimistic that the Western Europe, the European Union, can play a role in the solution of the problem of Russia against Ukraine. And well, as said, the expansion of the NATO is, in my opinion, a confirmation of what was happening since 1991. That is, we have to go backwards to 30 years at least. As regards one of the problems which we have most, in my opinion, in Western Europe, but also here, I cannot see really a solution, at least now, is that Western Europe has decided between the opposition, capital or production of work, that is either capital and fight against inflation, or production of works, of jobs. The decision of Western Europe is protection of capital, protection of a fight against inflation, a penalization of jobs production. This is, in my opinion, which is neoliberalism. It is not to be too much amazed about this. The problem is, in my opinion, Western Europe will not change its politics. That is, unless there is a global differentiation. Also, the protests which are in France now, but which could explode also in other countries, for instance, Spain, increases. I do not see really a solution in Western Europe, or I do not see that Western Europe can play a role. That is, Western Europe is something which receives orders and applies these orders. It is, I think, yes. I thank you very much. Yes, excuse me. So this is more or less what I wanted to say. And no, there is also, of course, very many things which could be said. I thank you very much anyway for the brilliant exposition, which gave me very, very many points to reflect on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gyan. Boa, thank you. We request you to kindly take note of a few more thoughts because of the dance of time, and we'll listen to your response towards the end.
Okay.
So any other question and thoughts, please? Okay, Minati.
Thank you, Ananta. I just have one thought to share. I would like to thank Professor Boa for very deep and insightful presentation. He covered all the aspects.
You can open your
What I-
video, please. You can open your
What I
video.
like is the most, the positive, the aspects of the pandemic, and as well as the not so positive. Am I audible?
Yes, yes. If possible, you can open your video.
Yeah, I have opened. So just one thing I want to share in the level of country, in India, we saw the social relationship was not so human, like it was not so positive. The human side of it came out, and the brutal side of the human face also came out, where the state also was failed to provide security to its citizens. I mean, things were not done, whatever they would have done that time. So this is that one point I wanted to share. And one more thing, I would agree so much. I mean, when Professor was telling one point, nature does not belong to us. It heals itself. I had written one poetry about it. So if time permits, towards the end, I will read it. And thank you so much. And thank you for this. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Any other friend, please? If not, we request Boa to kindly share his thought.
Thank you, Ananta. Well, there are in these kinds of talks, which we cover such a broad field of topics. There are always things that are not very well clarified. I think the first to start with the second question, I think that every country had a specific way of responding to the pandemic, even though there were some general ideas that I could compare. We could compare a little bit the type of policies that were followed in different countries. One of the lines that I decided to follow was something that may be problematic today, quite frankly. I have to analyze it further. It was the kind of left or right governments in power. I could see that whatever center-left governments were in power, they were more eager to protect life in the sense that life first, economy second. The rightist governments usually, England is a very paradigmatic case with Boris Johnson, economy first and life second. Boris changed when he got the COVID, and then he all of a sudden became a fan of the National Health Service in the UK. There were differences in different ways, and some of the authoritarian type of governments like Orban in Hungary or some in Central Africa used the pandemic to pass laws that were very detrimental, very neoliberal, and very detrimental to the people. In fact, like the farm laws, I would say, in India. So they use the idea that since people are confined, they cannot really protest, then you can have that. So I think that we have different responses, and it's very difficult to generalize about the pandemic. And I don't want in any way to generalize anyway. I just try to compile different trends that I noticed. The first question, I fully agree with you, Gianluigi. I really fully agree with you, and I pay a price for that, because as you know, in Europe today, we don't have a free press. In fact, we have propaganda, basically. It's very difficult to put an article in a major newspaper that, defends the type of policies that you are doing. I mean, it's impossible. We have to really go to the alternative outlets in which we can really say these things. I fully agree with you. I mean, the project of the neocons in the United States is to balkanize Russia as they did with Yugoslavia, is to dismember it and take control of the resources. I mean, the agriculture in Ukraine is already in the hands of the big companies, Cargill and others of the United States, like the oil fields in Iraq. Because the United States policy is dominated by the access to resources, basically. So the idea is that Russia, with such a rich type of resources in a large country, the largest of the world, of course, is quite something that they want to get hold of. So no question about that. But I think that the major conflict is with China, quite frankly. Why? Because the China has a border with Russia 6,000 kilometers. And China is building all the connections through the West, in part through Russia, or some of the republics of Russia. And in fact, the idea is that Russia is really a kind of, the neutralization of Russia is very important to stop China. And we are going to see the consequences of this, for instance, in Africa and Latin America, because China is a main investor in Africa, is a main investor in Latin America. And now we are going to see whether these countries are going to be destabilized or not according to their policies vis-a-vis China. So I think that you are right. I have been a very great fan of the BRICS. I'm a very good friend of the president of the bank now, Dilma Rousseff, who is now the president of the Bank of the BRICS. And the de-dollarization is going on, but it's a very long process, as you know. What we have now is the bilateral commerce is already denominated national currencies. For instance, between Saudi Arabia, Iran, India, and China, for instance, there are national currencies, or Russia, and not necessarily the dollar, for instance. The yuan, for instance, is also very much used. So there will be alternative currencies that will be created. This is particularly discussed at the organization of the Shanghai Cooperation, but it is a very, very long process, because they know, in fact, that the dollar is now the pillar upon which all the hegemony of the United States is built, because of the global financial capital. But this won't last, because the reason why is the same of the vaccine nationalism. The reason why the dollar loses credibility is because it is being weaponized more and more. I mean, the United States is applying sanctions against 30-something countries now. So as you saw, the SWIFT was withdrawn from Russia. So the people have to find alternatives. I agree with you that we are heading for a multipolar system. But for that, because I really pay a lot of attention to epistemology, I don't think that the West has the necessary skills, epistemological knowledges, to conceive of a multiple world, because colonialism has destroyed the capacity of the West from learning from other countries. And therefore, they don't know how to learn from the South. For instance, it is pathetic that Emmanuel Macron, that is a guy from the Rothschild family, that's going to participate in the BRICS meeting in South Africa. What for? It's pathetic. Is he going to convince them that they shouldn't do this or that? Are they going to pay any attention to Mr. Macron? Probably not. I mean, the global north is being ridiculous in the ways in which trying to convince the others. Convincing, no. Only war. By war, it may destroy a lot and may destroy a lot of people. So I think that the situation in which you are, and that's why I like to be an optimist in many ways, because I work with social movements, and in social movements, we work with people that are trying to find alternatives. But at the global level, I don't see at this point. I know that BRICS is the solution, one of the solutions, probably the most important solution. But I noticed last week a very disturbing piece of news in the Financial Times. And the piece of news is this. What the journalist is saying is that Brazil is democratic now, and Lula won the elections because Biden allowed it, because Biden prevented the counterfeit, the fake news that could destroy Lula. And therefore, Lula is president of Brazil thanks to Biden. What does this mean in international politics? Is that be careful. I saved you. So if you are becoming too aggressive in the BRICS policy, you may be in trouble. So we are going to see that what they call, if you look at the foreign affairs, they call them swing states. States that can move from one area to the other. Argentina, Brazil, Indonesia, for instance, they can move. Colombia, they are important countries. They can move. And I think they may be destabilized if necessary. And I think that's different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of politics are necessary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Boa, for this enriching dialogue. I just have one quick submission. Now, your engagement with Utopia, and it comes, but this engagement with Utopia also has to meet the dystopic aspect of Utopia, how utopias have turned into dystopias, because that is also the challenge of learning. So what is your thought on it, please?
Well, Ananta, I was expecting that question, quite frankly, coming from you, and I knowing your work. No, I don't share the modernist conceptions of Utopia, which I study them very carefully. My utopias are much closer to Ashish Kotari's type of initiatives, of the tapestries of initiatives in India, of local communities that are trying to do kinds of new things in the communities. They are, and I see them in Latin America as well. That is to say, the utopia now is not a utopia, is performative type of actions that perform different futures, but they are not global, they are not monocultural, because the modernist utopias from Thomas More onwards were monoculture. For years, utopia is monocultural. They have to be pluricultural, they have to be multiple. So I think that what we are seeing is what I call in my epistemology liberated zones. I see more people refusing to be in the cage of commodities, of capitalism, of lack of time, of acceleration of life, which is also stagnation, because it's a life that is not very well lived. And that's why the consumption of anxiolytics, of antidepressants is so high in the United States and Europe now. So because people are not happy. because of the way they live. So the liberated zones coming from youth, coming from peasants, coming from other people, they cannot be framed as an utopia. It's more a utopian style, performative, performing futures now. People are impatient. They don't want to wait for the future, because probably in the future, there will be no future. Particularly young people are very anxious about this. And therefore they want probably to enjoy something. In Russia, there was a very important movement in the 1860s, 1870s. They were called the nihilists. Well, it was related to anarchism, so to say, and later on became the anarchism known. But they were nihilists. Nihilists were the people that were going to the countryside, living with peasants, and trying to have a different experience of life and do the propaganda of a different type of socialism, but socialism not top down, but bottom up. If you ask me if I'm a socialist, yes, I could say, well, I don't think capitalism is the solution, but socialism only if it is not the modernist, Western-centric type of socialism, because that could lead to another gulag, and we don't want that, of course.
Thank you. Thank you. And I hope you are having a good stay in London. So now I request Minati, please, to share your vote of thanks.
One small poetry
And
I
a
wanted.
poetry.
Yes.
Yeah. So, thank you so much. It is just a few lines, and I had just written during pandemic, "The earth is smiling." The title is "The earth is smiling." In an extreme corner of optimism stood me. In an extreme corner of optimism stood me in a hope meet, ignoring the opposite corner's crook smile and static comments. See, nature heals itself. In Anthropocene of controlled need, if not taken for granted, if wounds are not turned canker. True to my hope, it proved again right. True to my hope, it proved again right, broke open all the boundaries of pollution, choking mask was thrown away. Subdued was rendered again green. Subdued was rendered again green, rooting deep to sustain. It started breathing, smiling, and never ready to compromise. That is the smiling earth. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to my poetry in such a late night. So now we can go towards vote of thanks.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I, Minati Pradhan, on behalf of Swadhyaya Sahachakra and Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming, would like to thank our today's chief speaker, Professor Boaventura D'Souza Santos, for his very deep and enriching presentation. Thank you, sir, so much for patiently answering all our questions and going deep into the subject. Thank you so much. We are happy to have you us today, have us today as a chief speaker. So thank you so much. I would like to thank Professor Ganluji for, as always, for his deep insights. And thank you, sir, so much. And I would like to, there were so many known figures, Professor Devendra Kumar Tiwari, MD Chandar Sahab, and so many people. So thank you all for being present with us and learning. And I thank all the people who are present with us in the Facebook platform and the Zoom platform, all for their valuable comments and opinions. Please pardon me if I have forgotten anybody's name, but I really want to thank all of you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you all and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.